Hello, Peace River Regional District. Welcome to the Grant Writer Services information session. My name is Dawn Johnson and I'm going to be leading you through the first half of our presentation today. So we are joining you from the unceded traditional territories of the Liwat and Snohomish nations. So I'd like to take a moment to introduce you to our grant writing team. We've got Monica and Claire, who are the primary grant writers for this project. Vanessa Carrington is our communications specialist, and she will be guiding us through the second half of the presentation. And my name is Dawn Johnson, and I am the project manager for this project, and I will be leading us through the first half of the presentation. And ClearCourse started working with the regional district back in March of 2021 for the Grant Writer Services program. And we are based in Pemberton, BC, which is a small town of about 3,000 people. And members of our team here are scattered throughout the region within about 130 kilometers of Pemberton. And we really do know, as residents of small communities, the impact that one idea or one project can have on an entire organization and really an entire community. And collectively, our team has over 40 years of grant writing experience. And, we're based in Pemberton currently. I grew up outside of Williams Lake, and members of our team have traveled extensively throughout BC, including regions in the north. And really, we're so excited to get to know the good work that's happening in the Peace region and the community groups in the area. So as you likely know already, this presentation is available on the Peace River Regional District's website. And there is a handout that's also available on the website that goes with this presentation that provides a list of the links and the resources that we discuss and go over in this presentation. On the website, you'll also find the Grant Writer Services guidelines, and within that document, you're going to find more information about grants, more information on how to work with the Grant Writer Services program, some tips, a frequently asked questions section, and a sample budget. So a great resource if you're not already aware of it, and you can head on over to the PRRD's website and download that from there. So today we're going to cover a few different topics. We're going to be talking about what a grant actually is, hopefully providing a bit of insight and clarity into the world of grant writing. We will be walking you through the steps on how to get your project grant ready. We will also be sharing with you some tips on grant writing. And finally, we'll wrap up with the process on how to work with the PRRD's Grant Writer Services program. So this information session today is going to be serving two purposes. The first is we are going to be providing information for community groups that want to build upon their existing grant writing skills. And then we're also going to be providing information for community groups that want to and plan to use the Grant Writer Services program. And we have already started working with many community groups within the region, and we know that some community groups are well on their way. They've written many successful grant applications, but perhaps they could use a little bit of support, knowledge, expertise. So we're hoping to share that with you. And we also know and understand that some community groups embarking on the world and the journey of grant writing is new to them. So we're hoping to be able to provide information on the program so that they can access services. So wherever you are on that spectrum, we can support you with your grant writing needs. So we know that for some people, grant writing can be like going to the dentist or doing your taxes. But for other people, like the members of our grant writing team, it can be a fun and exhilarating experience and even part of a fun and creative process. And the reality, however, is that many community groups find grant writing to be overwhelming. They're doing it off of the side of their desk. They don't have dedicated staff. And for small community groups that are primarily or sometimes exclusively run by volunteers, we know the impact and the stress that can have on an organization. And then when you layer on something like a world global pandemic, there's an increased need for funding. Community groups are responding to different requirements that they need to undertake in order to meet COVID safety regulations. They're pulled in many different directions. So we know that this is a hard time for community groups. We've experienced that ourselves in the work that we do down here in our own region. And at the end of the day, we hope that wherever you are, the information that we're able to provide to you can provide the support that you need, whether that be through accessing the Grant Writer Services program and having us, do quite a bit of support for you, or if it's just that you need a little bit of help to get your funding application out the door. So we thought we'd provide a definition on what a grant is because there's a little bit of confusion around that definition. And so really a grant is a non-repayable cash contribution and a way for an organization or a community group that has limited funding to be able to implement projects. And we typically see grants mostly available for nonprofit organizations, which can include charities, registered BC societies, Indigenous communities, lower levels of government, municipal and regional. But grants are also available for businesses, individuals, schools, academic institutions, non-registered community groups, all sorts of things. So you get the picture. There's pretty much a grants are available for everybody. And although grants can sometimes feel like a gift or like free money, there are certainly requirements and expectations associated with them. And oftentimes this can include funder recognition. So a funder may ask or stipulate that you need to include their logo on something that's created or produced. Organizations that receive funding need to use the funds as they said they would. So you really need to stay true to your original vision, to your original budget, unless you seek and obtain that permission from the funder to make some major changes. But for the most part, you need to stick with what you said you were going to do. And finally, there are always reporting requirements associated with grants. So organizations need to know that there are always some strings attached to grant funding. Grants are also competitive, and at times they can be highly competitive. But the good news is that funders actually want to give you money, and in most instances, they're actually tied to their mandates, their objectives, and also their budgets. So, for example, the federal budget rolls out and they've got so many millions of dollars set aside for agriculture. And those funds get channeled through the Ministry of Agriculture, who then create different programs and funding streams to be able to support initiatives that align with their goals and their mandates. And they have those funds in their annual budget and they need to get those funds out the door. And then on the other receiving end of things, you may have an organization in the Peace region that is really focused around agriculture, and they apply to Ministry of Agriculture programs, and then they receive some funds to also achieve their goals. And in this way, grants are also a way for funders and for recipients to achieve common goals. Funding in Canada is no small change. It's about $6 billion worth of grants that are available annually, and there's over 4,000 government programs alone. And this doesn't include foundations like private, public, and family foundations, or cooperative gifting programs or corporate gifting programs. And so there are really a lot of different opportunities to get your projects funded through grant funding. So as you can see by this list, there are funds available for nearly every sector. And if you don't see your sector reflected here, not to worry, we probably just haven't included it. So typically a funder will post grant guidelines along with the grant application form on their website. And it's important for community groups to review these two documents carefully. And within those documents, you're going to find information around eligibility. And what eligibility can actually be broken into two different pieces here. So the first is, does your group qualify for the funding? We've seen some funders will only fund organizations that are registered charities or nonprofits in BC. And one of the requirements with that funding application is you need to provide proof of that. And so if you don't have that, you are not eligible for that funding. And the other portion of that equation is, does your project actually qualify? So if we were to look at that Ministry of Agriculture opportunity that we were talking about earlier, they have a honeybee program that looks to support community groups to undertake research to study honeybee health over time. And so that project is very specific in what they will fund. If you're looking to just, do some educational community hives or look at other components of honeybee distribution in the area, that might not qualify. So you need to be really sure that your project that you're looking at hand in hand with the funding opportunity is well aligned to make sure that you're eligible for the funding. The other component of this is the use of funds. So this is eligible and ineligible costs. And again, those can be found most often in the grant guidelines. And we often see eligible costs being costs directly associated with the project or the program that you are seeking grant funding for. But at times, a funder will say, we will fund materials and supplies and professional fees, but we will not fund salaries or wages for staff to work on that project. So you need to really review those eligible and ineligible costs carefully. Examples of ineligible costs, like I say, it varies from situation to situation, but oftentimes we see things such as rent, operational costs of the organization, hydro, administrative costs being examples of ineligible costs for a funding application. Another consideration includes matched funding. And matched funding is where a grant is conditional on a community group contributing a certain amount of funds to the project. And so you can see there's three different examples that we've provided below in these diagrams. The first example, the funder will say, we can contribute 75% of project costs to your initiative, and the community group is required to contribute 25%. And I want to note that that 25% doesn't necessarily have to come in the form of cash contributions from the organization through their contingency funds or their rainy day funds. That can come through sometimes in-kind contributions, so donations or volunteer labor from the community group or from partners that you have. And it can also come from other funding that you've secured from a different source. So in the example B in the middle there, the funder has said they'll provide up to 90% of the funds, and the community group only needs to provide 10% of the project costs. And in the last example, the funder provides 100% of project costs. And we've seen this happen quite a bit lately with the federal infrastructure grants that have become available with COVID. Two more considerations are timelines and reporting. And let's just take a moment to walk through this timeline graphic below. So as you can see, a fund will have an opening date and a closing date. So for example, a funding may be available come May 15th and will close on August 1st. So there's a funding window there for community groups to apply. And then, after August 1st, it takes a bit of time for that funder to make their decision. And it may be a matter of weeks or even months until the funding is announced and awarded. And we've seen this take anywhere from 4 weeks all the way up to 18 months for large federal infrastructure projects. So important to understand that when you are assessing the alignment between the funding opportunity and your project, to make sure that what you want to do fits within the funder's timeline. Further to that, funding opportunities often have a must start date and a must finish date. So for example, that funding opportunity that you might find out in October for might have a must start date by January 1st, 2023, and must wrap up by, hopefully they give you more than a few months, maybe let's say, August 15th of the following year. And then finally, there are always, as we mentioned before, reporting requirements associated with grants. And at times there can be an interim report that's required, and this is just sort of like a midway catch up with the funder. You let them know how you're doing with the project, if you have been able to stick with the original project plan, if you're experiencing difficulties, or if you're way ahead of schedule, you're almost done, and that's great. So it's an opportunity to check in with the funder at that progress report or interim report. And then finally, there's always, as we say, a final report that's required at the end of your project. So those are, it's important for community groups to understand those requirements and make sure that you can fulfill them for your grant funded project. So there's a variety of funding agencies and organizations that offer grants to all types of recipients, like we talked about earlier. Now, as we were saying earlier, there are different levels of government that fund grant programs. So this can be federal, provincial, regional, and all the way down to municipal levels of government. So they distribute funds to community groups. And this also includes crown corporations like BC Hydro, an important source of funding for some communities. Now we've got foundations that also provide funding, and this can be private foundations, public foundations, or family foundations. And an example of this in the region is the Northeast BC Community Foundation. And often these foundations are tied very strongly to the things that they believe in. So, there's this foundation that looks to improve the life of children living with diabetes. And then there's also corporations that have different funding programs. And this is sometimes referred to as community gifting or community giving programs. And you can usually find the details of those programs on their corporate site. So it's kind of like giving back. So how are they giving back to the community? And examples of this in the area is AltaGas, Canfor, and Air Canada. And finally, cooperatives also have similar sorts of gifting or giving programs as corporations. And they as well will have something that they feel is really aligned with the values of their organization. So Vancity, for example, for a while there was supporting programs that looked to increase financial literacy in communities. Mountain Equipment Co-op is another example of a cooperative that has a gifting program, a community gifting program. And so I just want to note as well that there is another source of funding that the Peace River Regional District Grant Writer Services Program does not cover. And this is corporate sponsorship. And corporate sponsorship can be an important source of funding for community groups. And what corporate sponsorship is it is an exchange of cash funding for a community group in exchange for typically marketing. So a corporation will want to see, a wing of the hospital named after them. Or growing up as a kid in Williams Lake, for me, it was the local hockey rink was named after the local mill for a while. So there's an exchange of money for marketing, and that comes through some sort of agreement, and those services are not covered through the Grant Writer Services program because it's more of a partnership agreement than it is a funding application. So next we're going to walk you through all the different things that you need to think about to get your ducks in a row to turn your awesome idea into a grant-funded project. So what we're really aiming for here with projects that seek grant funding is getting them to be grant ready. So I just want to read the slide that we have here, just so we're all on the same page. So the definition of being grant ready: a community group has all of the information needed to complete a grant application. And this includes a project description, a budget, matched funds, and more. And they can commit to getting the project off the ground as soon as the funds are awarded. So just like this amazing cutting board that everybody needs in their house, every great idea needs a really solid plan. And successful funding applications always start with a project being grant ready. And when we say this, there are many different pieces around that. The project needs to be able to articulate to the funder who benefits, how do they benefit, how many people, what is the vision of your project, what is it that you're actually looking to achieve. Do you know what your activities are, your timelines, who are your partners, what are they going to do, who's at the table with you? Who is providing you with some funding? Who's providing you with program support? All of those different things. So those are some of the questions and the components of being grant ready. And we're going to dive into that a little deeper. So now we're going to take you through a checklist of the items that you need to consider when you're getting your project to be grant ready. And these are also some of the common questions that are asked by a funder or the common components of a grant application. So alignment with the community group's vision. This comes back again to that eligibility piece we talked about earlier, making sure that your project and your community group is eligible and aligned with the priorities of the funder. If you go ahead and apply for a fund that doesn't have good alignment, you're not making very good use of your time. Project description, desired outcomes, and your benefit statement. These three things together are sort of where you paint a really detailed picture for your funder about what it is that you want to achieve, who you're targeting, what the impact is to the community, how they're going to benefit, and more. So just really providing a lot of detail in there. And then the next on the list, the project activities. This is where you take a step back from your project and you list out all of the things that you need to do to get your project done. So for example, if I'm building a new garden bed, I gotta remove the sod, bring in the soil, purchase the seeds, recruit some help to do all those things. And then those activities are really reflected in your budget. So if I say that I'm going to purchase seeds as one of my activities, I need to include purchasing seeds in my budget. So a seed budget in there as well. And then also those activities, as we said earlier, are also associated with the timeline. So you need to know what it is that you want to do and when it is that you need to or want to do those things. So a few other things on your checklist. Letters of support or endorsement. These can add a lot of weight to your funding application, and they often come from local leaders, politicians, partners for your project that may be providing in-kind expertise or support. Yeah, they're not to be underestimated. They add a lot of weight to validate the need for your project. Circling back to the matched fund component of grant applications, sometimes this is required, sometimes it is not. But if you have somebody that's contributing funds to your project, whether or not it's required in the funding application or funding requirements, it's always a great idea to, as often as possible, provide proof of those matched funds. That also adds a lot of weight to a funding application. The third item on that list, project sustainability. It kind of confuses people sometimes when a funder asks, what is your project sustainability plan? Because we associate that so much with environmental sustainability, but really what the funder is looking to understand is how will your project sustain over time once you've spent all of the funds that we've given you. So if we look again at that garden idea, year one, we've given you all the money that you need to create this beautiful big community garden. How are you going to sustain that project once year one has completed and you no longer have funds from us? How are you going to sustain that over time? And that's where you might say, oh, we're collecting membership fees and that's going to pay for A, B, C, and D. And then finally, the evaluation plan. And this is a way for you to communicate some of your successes or your challenges with the funder. It's also a way to report back on how you made out with your project. Say with that community garden example, you wanted to work with 5 different regional groups to share knowledge on local growing practices. And in the end, you were able to work with 10. So in your evaluation plan, you can share that good news with the funder. And that is the evaluation plan part and the end of our checklist. And I'm going to pass it over to Vanessa now, who's going to be leading us through the second half of our presentation. So thanks again for listening. And Vanessa, over to you.
Thanks, Dawn, for walking us through that great information, everything about grants and getting your project grant ready. So now I'll take you through some grant writing tips as well as where to find grant opportunities, some resources, and then finally we will step through the process of what to expect when you reach out and work with the Grant Writer Services team through the Peace Rivers program. So grant writing tips. The very first thing to do is read your application and the guidelines carefully. In fact, read them several times. Often you'll find that there's some details that you miss on the first read through. The good thing is most funders will provide detailed guidelines that accompany their application, which will help answer frequently asked questions, dive into a bit more detail about eligibility, either for your project or the costs associated with your project. Then also make sure that you pay extra attention to any additional requirements above and beyond the grant application. So you will need to fill in a grant application. It may have 10 questions, it may have 100 questions, who knows. But the funder may request that you submit additional documents or information. These can include letters of support, they could include a KML location file, or even some engineering plans if you're looking at building some new infrastructure, greenhouse gas emissions, and the list goes on. So make sure that you pay attention to those. Then we recommend that you reach out to the funder, and this is typically called a funding officer or a program officer. The reason we suggest to do this is A, to just clarify any questions that you may have that you noted when you were reviewing the guidelines and the application, and B, also to ask them about the funding limit. There usually will be a funding limit posted with the information about the grant, whether that's $10,000 maximum, $100,000 maximum. But the reason you want to ask the funder about that maximum is often the most successful applications don't necessarily request the full amount. So you may find that the average amount requested for a successful application could be well below that maximum, and that may be where you want to fit your project into so that you increase your chances of being successful. So for example, if a funding limit per applicant is $10,000, but then the funder suggests that, typically we award grants to applicants around $7,500, then you may want to tailor your project costs to that amount. It's also good to be in contact with the funder if you have any questions while you're going through the grant writing process, and then also after your application has been submitted, you may want to follow up with them. Next, we suggest that you prioritize all of the work that you need to do in order to submit your grant on time. If there are additional requirements and documents that you need to include with your application, you may need to get on top of those sooner than later. In fact, you may need to start those well before you start the application. And a good example of this is council band and board resolutions. They can take several weeks to actually go through the process of approvals and then make it back to you on time. So get on top of those first, and then you can start working away at the other requirements and the application. We also recommend that you build your application in a word processing application like Microsoft Word. This will enable you to edit more freely, share your document with your colleagues, perhaps with partners or a grant writer or an applicant in our case. And it'll enable you to track your changes if you need to and save it safely locally to your computer. The reason this is valuable is often the funder will have an online application form. Sometimes you can save a draft of that application form online, but if there are any technical glitches with the funder's website, you may lose everything. So we really suggest that you build it offline in Microsoft Word, and then when you're ready, you can upload those responses to the questions to the online form. There's been a lot of talk in the last few years about the power of storytelling through grant writing, and it really is a powerful way to build a compelling story about your organization and about your project and pull the funder into the emotional part of why you need some funding. But we want you to focus on storytelling to a point. We often find that funders have online forms that have character limits, so you are going to be limited in just how much storytelling you can offer in response to each of the questions that the funder asks. So just make sure that you are working within character limits, but that you're also being clear and you're not drifting too far from the objectives of your project and your organization. You also want to be truthful. This really helps build credibility with the funder. They may be familiar with the sector that you work in, and they may be familiar with the project that you're proposing, so make sure that you're always truthful, especially around facts and quotes and statistics. And then make sure that you validate those facts through doing your own research. Sometimes you may be required to cite resources within the application, and most certainly you'll want to cite any facts and statistics that you include in letters of support. Proofread your application before you submit it. Go back to the funder's checklists, ensure that you've met all of their requirements, reread the questions to ensure that you have answered them clearly, and then if you can, submit your application at least a couple of days before the deadline. This will allow for any glitches that you may encounter with the funder's website, and potentially if you notice that you've missed some questions or you have overlooked a document that needs to be submitted with your application, this will give you a bit of breathing space to ensure that you still meet the funder's deadline. And then once you've submitted your application, if you don't hear back from the funder around the time that they suggested that the funds were going to be awarded, reach out to them. You'll hopefully have their contact information already, and ask them where they're at with announcing these successful applicants. If they have announced the successful applicants already and unfortunately your application was declined, maybe ask them about what you could do better, perhaps what you overlooked, and if there'll be another intake that you can submit that updated application to. Now I'd like to take you through the top reasons grant proposals are usually successful. These are things that we have learned through our years of grant writing, and we hope that they help you with your next grant application. So going back to what Dawn talked about just earlier, you really want to ensure that your project is grant ready. Now, you will have to have a grant ready project in order to answer all of the funders' questions, but what this is more speaking to is that your project can start and can finish within the funders' prescribed timelines. So that also means grant ready. So we see some people submit great applications, strong, compelling reason why the funds are necessary, but ultimately they're unable to start or finish the project within the funders' timelines, and therefore they aren't successful. Back to the compelling story, make sure that you share a story that pulls the funder in, kind of tugs at their emotional heartstrings, that they're going to feel like you need the funds above and beyond every other applicant. Successful applications are also really well aligned with the funder's priorities. Funders will have their own mandate for how they want those funds to affect change. They will have their own organizational requirements on what objectives they need to meet, and if you can align your project or your foundation or organization's priorities with the funders, then they are more likely to support your application. If it's appropriate, make sure you demonstrate an inclusive approach. These are the applications that we also see are most successful. The ones that are able to leverage local contractors and vendors that work with youth if appropriate, and that are ultimately building capacity in their communities. A well thought out and detailed budget goes hand in glove with a successful application, as well as demonstrating that you have secured matched funding if that's required. Dawn mentioned earlier about an asset management plan. This is the piece where you are demonstrating that you will have the funds available, whether that's through partnerships, additional grants that you may have secured, or your own internal financial capacity to support the ongoing operations and maintenance of a project. So even though you need the funds in order to finish the project, you will be self-sustaining once those funds run out. And then of course you have demonstrated support for the project. That's typically through letters of support from your partners, from peers in the same sector, or perhaps partners in the region, whether that's government, municipal, right through to provincial. So as many letters of support that you can submit with your application will really demonstrate the need for the funding. We always hope that grant applications or grant proposals are successful, but unfortunately sometimes they are declined, and these are some of the reasons why they can often be declined. The project didn't align with the funder's priorities. This is where you really want to make sure you do your research and ensure that the funding stream that you apply to is a really good fit for your project. The application didn't follow the funder's format and perhaps didn't answer the questions. Make sure that you pay close attention to the question that the funder's asking and be as honest and transparent as you can in your responses and really clear. The application was unclear and even assumed that the funder had prior knowledge. You want to make sure that you are really providing as much background information as you can to the funder. They may not have any understanding of the area that you work in or the knowledge of the project that you are proposing. So make sure that you're being super clear in your explanations. The project impact was limited. Funders really want to extend their funds as far as they can to as many community groups as possible. So you want to really demonstrate that with the funding, the project that you're going to implement is going to have a broad impact, either within your organization, within your community, or perhaps even with visitors to your community. Applications are also often declined because the budget is unclear. Perhaps it's not detailed enough. Perhaps you haven't included a contingency budget. And also you haven't been able to demonstrate that you can sustain your project or your program once the funding has ended. And that's that sustainability piece that Dawn talked about previously. Grant proposals are also declined when the funding request is for too much. Now, this could be above and beyond the maximum amount that the funder has defined in the grant guidelines, Or perhaps you have asked for the maximum amount, and as I mentioned earlier, they typically may provide funding to a lesser amount, so you want to make sure that you fit within the defined amount that the funder has suggested would be most successful for that grant application. And then sometimes we do see applications are declined because the application requested too little. And this is more relevant to large infrastructure projects where the minimum could be, for example, $10 million. And then lastly, but most commonly, all of the funds were allocated and ultimately the funding stream has been oversubscribed. This is a good opportunity for you to reach out to the funder and see if there's another intake, and then hopefully resubmit, and you will be successful the second time around. Now I'd like to talk to you about finding grants, and this can feel a bit like detective work when grants feel like they're spread out all over the internet across thousands of organizations, and it feels like it's going to take an astronomical amount of time to research grants, especially ones that fit your organization or your project. So here are some tips to doing your own grant research if that's what you would prefer to do. There are also resources that we use here at ClearCourse to support you in your grant search. And please know that we'll be providing all of the links that are shared within this presentation in a handout that will be available on the Peace River Regional District's website along with this presentation. So finding grants. At ClearCourse we have a really focused list of around 400 grants. We have a heavy focus on those that are in the province of BC and for community groups and non-profit groups. So we can do a grant search for you. We can narrow that down by sector and amount and location and funder and help you find some suitable funding options for your project. You'll also find that the provincial and federal governments, the provincial government of BC and the federal government have great search tools on their websites for finding suitable grant programs. And then you'll need to reach out to local municipalities and regional districts and look at their websites for any local funding programs that they offer. Foundations and registered charities will often have grant programs. Some good lists to look out for: the Federal Government of Canada has a registered charity list where you can sort by location and name. And then Charity Village has a foundation list on their website that's sorted alphabetically. They do provide the province with each listing, but unfortunately are unable to search by province. But you can scan through that list and see any that are in your region and reach out to those foundations directly to see if they have any grant programs. Local and regional corporations or companies will also offer company gifting or community gifting opportunities. So you'll want to do some research about which organizations and companies are in your area and reach out to them directly as well. They'll often have that information on their website. There are also paid search tools that you can use. Now these will range from around $33 per month right up to $150 per month. Some of them offer monthly subscriptions, some only offer a subscription annually. So what we suggest is, try one or two of these tools if you are struggling to find grants that are suitable for your project. And do as many searches as you can within a month so you get the best value and you get a sense of the quality of database entries that company is collecting. Sometimes they're really relevant, sometimes they may be expired yet still in the database, so you really want to test it on, try it on for size before you invest in something like an annual subscription. And examples of those are Grant Connect, Grant Watch, and Grant Advance. And again, a list of all of these links will be provided in a handout on the Peace Rivers website along with this presentation. And then lastly, what we also recommend is reaching out to community groups, similar in structure, similar in their focus and their vision and their mission, and ask them how they have funded their programs. We find that community groups are really open to sharing this information with one another and supporting one another. So you may find some interesting information about grant possibilities from similar community groups. And also sign up for email newsletters. Several organisations like BC Healthy Communities and the BC Economic Development Association, as well as First Peoples Cultural Council, they will often send out newsletters with lists of upcoming grants, updates on grants if there's been changes in deadlines. And this is a really great resource of information if you're looking to do your own grant searches. So lastly, I'd like to step you through working with a grant writer as part of the Peace River Regional District's Grant Writer Services program. The very first thing to know is these services are indeed free to you, so there's no cost to reach out to a grant writer, to work with a grant writer, and for that grant writer to assist you with your grant application. So we really encourage you to reach out if you are either struggling to get a grant application completed by a deadline, or you really need some guidance in how the whole process works. So there are 3 core services that we will provide. The first is finding suitable grants using many of the resources that I touched on in the previous slides. We'll also help you write that application. Now, we can take the lead doing that, or we can support you as you write your own application. And lastly, we'll assist you with any additional documents and requirements that the funder may be asking for. That could be calculating greenhouse gas emissions, generating a KML file, so a location file using Google Earth, or it could even mean drafting letters of support for your partners, or perhaps drafting board council resolutions for you to submit for signing. So the first step with working with a grant writer involves completing a community group intake form. This form is available on the Peace River Regional District's website, or one of our grant writers will send this to you when you reach out to us by email. This form gives us a snapshot of your organization, an overview of your project, and it also gives you an opportunity to provide any grant streams that you've identified that you think are suitable for your project. Then step 2, we will schedule a discovery meeting with you. This gives us an opportunity to dive a little deeper into the details about your organization and your project. We can talk through perhaps some of the details of your project that aren't grant ready and see how we can get you to grant ready. And then we'll also just go over some of the timing of your project, when you hope you can start and finish by, and gather those details. And what they will do is inform step 3, which is a grant search. If you haven't already identified a suitable funding stream, we'll go back to our database and some of the other databases available, and we'll do a search to see if we can find some suitable funding options for you. Ideally, we'll provide up to 3 results, and then together we'll select the best grant stream, and then that will help us kick off the grant writing. So step 4, grant application writing. We will either take this on for you, as I mentioned earlier, or we'll support you as you write your own grant application. The next step is to review your application and make sure that we have met all of the funder's requirements and that we have all of the required documents that need to accompany the grant application. And then once we've done that with you, we will support you with submitting all of the documents by the required deadline. Now, sometimes the funder will require that you create an account with their online grant application website so that you can submit it digitally. For example, the BC government has a government services website called BCEID, and you will require an account with them in order to submit a grant application. And this can take longer than a week. So this is one of the things that we will prioritize when we first do a grant search and identify a suitable grant. If that grant is with the provincial government, we'll make sure that we get that account request underway early in the process so that we have that for the end when we're ready to submit. Step 6, once you have submitted the grant application, then the grant writer will send you a link to a Peace River Regional District survey, and this survey is hosted with the Regional District, and it's an opportunity for you to share feedback about the Grant Writer Services program and help the Peace River improve the program over time, and provide any feedback on how we can improve our services in support of you as you seek funding. And then finally, because you were the applicant and submitted your grant application, the funder is most likely to get back to you about whether your application was successful or if it was declined. And it'd be great if you could reach out to ClearCourse or directly to the grant writer who you worked with and with the Peace River to make sure that you just check back in about the status of your application, whether it was successful or not. And this will help us ensure that if we apply to the same funding stream, the same funding stream again, that we address any issues that the funder had. And it also helps the Peace River track the number of grant applications that were successful so that they can provide that information back to the Northern Development Initiative Trust who are helping fund this program. So that's working with a grant writer. We would also like to encourage you to sign up for the Grant Opportunities email newsletter. This is a monthly newsletter that's sent by the Peace River Regional District, and it includes upcoming grants and grant tips, and hopefully some good news stories about grants that have been awarded to community groups in the Peace River region. And so that wraps up the Grant Writer Services information session. We hope that we have shared some valuable information with you today. And if you do have any questions or you would like to work with a grant writer, please reach out to us. We are at grantwriter@prrd.bc.ca. That email address goes directly to Dawn, our project manager, and she will confirm your eligibility and connect you with the grant writer who will support you with your application. If you do have any other questions, you'll also find some resources on the Peace River Regional District's website, and the link is there below. There you will find the guidelines document, the community group intake form, and also the sign up for the email newsletter. We'll also be posting a handout with all of the links that were mentioned in our presentation today so that you can go to those directly if you're doing your own grant research. Thanks a lot for joining us.